Good morning and welcome to the October 5th, 2015 workshop of the Orlando City Council. Today we're going to be focused on urban development parking requirements, and part of our vision for downtown Orlando from our Project DTO exercise, it is a downtown that is well connected. And it is pretty easy to get around our downtown now without a vehicle because of limo or bike share or car share. And it's becoming popular to commute on Sunrail or Lynx. But many of our downtown workers and residents still rely on vehicles, and I don't think that's going to be a sea change overnight. So we want to make sure that we balance the need for ample parking for those vehicles, but also encourage transit-oriented development. We don't want a downtown full of parking garages, but we don't want a downtown that people complain about that they can't park either. So we're going to focus on our current parking requirements and practices, how they compare with other cities. We had a project, what was the name of the project over against I-4 that came through?
11 West Jefferson, the Orlando Central project.
Central, and everything we have has Central or City or something in it these days. And Commissioner Gray had raised some concerns about where we ended up on that particular project. So hence, I've had our guys take a look at this and wanted to get thoughts from council related to parking.
Yeah, and we'll review that case, but good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm here with Tanya Wilder from the Transportation Planning Division and Jason Burton from the City Planning Division. I'm F.J. Flynn from the Economic Development Department, and we are going to look at parking requirements for urban development today. And so the structure of today's presentation will be to kind of cover some recent cases. We're going to look at some of the factors that we use to grant parking reductions in the urban core. We're going to look at our current practices, and then we're going to look at our policies and compare them with some of the policies that we're seeing nationally. So before we get into the cases, the city's Chapter 61 is roadway and access management. Part 3 of that deals with parking, and so the first few sections of that deal with parking design. We're going to focus today on kind of those final two sections with required number of spaces and our special downtown area rules. So the mayor alluded to this earlier. We had one catalytic project, the Orlando Central project, and so we're going to review that case, and then we're also going to kind of contrast that with another project that has come to us recently, and we're just going to kind of look at some of the differences and some of the factors that led us to come to two totally different conclusions on these projects. So the Orlando Central project, primarily a residential tower. They had some retail. By code, they're required to provide over 700 spaces, and they didn't think they needed that much, and they were offering a little bit less than 500. And so when we looked at that request to reduce the parking, we considered, is this project within the downtown core? What is its accessibility to transit? And so is it in close proximity to limo? Is it in close proximity to Sunrail? And the answer to both those questions is yes. It's bordered by Gertrude's Walk, which is a great pedestrian amenity that runs right through the middle of our central business district. It's also in the downtown parking area. We'll get into that in a little bit, and there's some things that we can do in the downtown parking area that we can't do in other places. And then the other two factors were that you had the Jefferson Street garage and the Central garage within very close proximity to the site. And so if there was additional parking needed, we felt that what better place to put some of that additional demand than a city facility. So staff supported and BZA granted the 36% reduction, and then City Council approved that a couple of months ago. Now we're going to contrast that project with the 520 East Church Street project, and so again, it's another project that's primarily residential, it has some retail. They were required to provide 618 spaces by code, and they came to us and asked for a 25% reduction. And so some of the things that we looked at and decided that it really wasn't a good idea to grant this reduction was that it's at the eastern edge of downtown. There's really no adjacent public parking facilities to this project. There's less parking available, and they were putting this project in an area where we've got known issues with spillover parking, and so and it's not adjacent to commuter rail. And so we felt that if we had granted that reduction, we could have additional spillover into residential areas. So we did not support that request, and the developer went back and modified their project to meet the minimum parking requirements. So some of the questions that were raised in this process was, why does the city reduce required minimum parking? How does the city, what are the mechanics? How do we actually grant parking reductions? How do Orlando's practices compare with similar cities? And is that 40% cap that we've placed on the maximum reduction, is that reasonable? So question number one, why does the city reduce the required minimum number of parking spaces? Well, keep in mind that our parking code and a lot of our ordinances basically look at maximum impact on projects. And so when a project comes in, we assume that it will have the maximum impact. And so if we're looking at impact fees, it's maximum impact. When we're looking at sewer capacity, it's maximum impact. And so there is no one-size-fits-all solution to projects. Parking demand is no different than some of the other maximum impact things we look at. And so it is affected, though, by proximity to other transportation modes, proximity to complementary land uses. And so what that means is how much is this use interacting with other uses in close proximity, and are people able to walk or bike or use some other mode of travel to get there? What is the context of the location? And so are there good walking facilities and other amenities that the city has provided that helps reduce the amount of traffic and the amount of parking that's needed? And then it also relies on the demographics of users. I'm sure you're all aware of sort of some of the demographic data that we're getting from younger generations. They're not as auto-centric as maybe some of us are, and so that has an impact on parking demand as well. And then the other thing too is that while our code is kind of a one-size-fits-all, we all recognize that there's different areas of the city that have vastly different demands on a variety of all these reasons. So we also took a look at national data. And so what does the national data reveal? Well, the data says that TOD housing generates about 47% less traffic volume. And so, well, why is that? And so when you go back and take a look at some of the trip generation data, transportation engineering became a real science out of necessity. And so after World War II, you saw rapid suburbanization, vehicle ownership kind of went through the roof, and so there was a whole discipline that sort of grew up overnight, and a lot of the data that we used to develop codes is reliant on a lot of this 1950s and 60s data that has a very heavy suburban component to it. And so when we apply that data to developing codes, it sort of is heavily weighted on a more suburban type model. So if TOD housing generates 47% less traffic volume, that has a correlation to parking demand. What we also found is that there's this 2020 oversupply rule, and that says that nationally the oversupply of parking for projects increases the cost of projects by up to 20% and actually reduces the usable area of a site by 20%. And so in an environment where we've got over 45% of our households spending more than a third or almost a third of their income on housing, parking can have a real impact on affordability. Some of the other things that we learned is that parking oversupply is a real disincentive for transit ridership, and so we've invested a lot in Sunrail, the limo expansions, and so to have a parking policy that is too liberal sort of is counter to some of the objectives that we have in getting transit ridership. And then lastly, retailers in the urban core really aren't as dependent on auto-centric consumers as they are in suburban areas. So question number 2, how does the city grant parking reductions? Well, we started out by developing a downtown parking area. And so the downtown parking area helps downtown develop as a true urban place. And couple of the tenets with the downtown parking area in that establishment is that parking policy influences development and development decisions, and parking policy, as the mayor had said in his opening comments, has long-term effects. And so the decisions that we're making today can kind of have, a 10, 15, 20-year impact on the surrounding area. When we look at the downtown Orlando minimum parking comparison, you can see that for retail, offices, and hotels, we have already by right reductions anywhere between 30 and 100%. But for whatever reason, when you start looking at multifamily residential, there is no by right reduction. And so when we look at some of these cases and we look at some of the requests for modifications that we're being asked to do, a lot of it is on that multifamily residential component. So what are the other by right parking reductions within the city? Government assisted elderly housing, there's a by right 40% reduction. And then if you have a mixed use development within a half mile of a commuter rail station, you get between a 14 and a 16% overall reduction. So what other reduction tools do we have in our tool chest? Well, there's joint parking agreement, and that says that if I have an available supply of parking in excess of what I need to serve my own project, I can actually negotiate with another property owner to allow him to park on my property. And the only thing that we require is that it's not like a year-to-year contract. It has some lasting components to it, and that the parking facility and the site that's generating the parking demand are proximate to one another. And so there's a whole concept of pedestrian shed that we can get into if you want. I might need Jason's help on that. But anyway, so how else do we reduce parking? We do it by permit. Conditional use permits, we can reduce for a residential project with a mixed use component, we can reduce the parking up to 25%. And that comes back before this board for final approval. There's also parking reductions by modification. So our zoning official has the ability to reduce parking by 10%, 10% or 2 spaces, whichever is greater, and that's a simple zoning official approval, zoning official determination. We also can reduce parking through zoning variance, and so there's no maximum reduction specified. I know we've talked about 40%. There is no maximum specified, and requires Board of Zoning Adjustment approval, and again, those approvals come back before you for approval, as did the Orlando Central project. So where are parking variances allowed? Well, in our mixed-use corridors, office corridors, and activity center areas, you can ask for a reduction of up to 15% based on mode split. And mode split is basically if it's 90% auto, 5 transit, and 5 bike ped, you can't ask for a higher reduction if your mode split doesn't match up with what you're asking for. There's also shared parking for mixed use. Again, no maximum reduction specified, and the uses have to be non-coincidental. And so if, for example, if you have a office and a multifamily development, we would allow you to enter into a shared parking agreement, because the office component parks heavily during the day and the residential component parks heavily during the night. And so the things that we look at when that variance is asked to be approved is kind of what happens during the transition time, that period between 4 and 7 where your office workers are leaving and your residential folks are coming back home. We also allow alternative transportation services variances up to 40%, and those are based basically on transit, proximity, and carpool, vanpool programs. And in those cases, either criteria, both criteria can apply. As far as parking variance review factors, what are some of the things that we look at? We already talked about parking spillover, and so what is the risk of some of the parking that's not being parked on site, what is the risk of that spilling over into adjacent neighborhoods? What is the availability of public parking? And we also require an operational study, and so this is an engineered study that shows sort of the comings and goings, how much traffic is being generated, how much parking is needed. And then we also look at the transit environment, proximity to transit stops, whether it's regular bus service, limo, or commuter rail, and then how walkable is the environment. And so if there's no sidewalks and it's open swale drainage, we're probably less apt to, buy the notion that someone's going to walk a half mile to pick up a bus. So question 3 is, how do the city's practices compare to similar cities? And so before we get into the actual case examples, what are some of the things that support parking reductions and in other areas? And so when we looked at it, transit incentives was a big component. And so are you buying, as a property holder or a developer, are you buying transit passes for your residents and your employees? Does the municipality have transit supportive zoning? And so that is, are you providing the density and the intensity that's needed to support transit? So if you have a subdivision that's, one lot per quarter acre, 1 to 4 units per acre, you're really not generating enough ridership there to support transit. Do you allow share parking? Do you provide car share and bike share services? Are you making the investment in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure? And are you looking at real-time payment and parking technology? And so I think on these first few items, I think we've made significant inroads in all these areas. I think we're still working on, the concept of dynamic parking pricing, but it may not be here today, but it's not to say that we won't implement something like that in the future. So we looked at 17 cities. We've got 10 listed here. The interesting thing to note to start with is just that the top 4 here have no parking requirements in downtown whatever. And so for each use, it's 100% reduction within their central business district. So we'll start with Austin, Texas. They have area-based reductions. Their multifamily residential requirements allow for 20% by right parking reductions in their central districts. In special zoning districts, they allow up to 60%. And then if you look at the central business district, 100% of the reduction is allowed by right. Moving on to Sacramento, again, they have zoning district-based reductions, and for multifamily in their traditional city area, it's 33% by right. In their urban districts, it's 67%, and again, in the central business and in their entertainment district, it's 100% a reduction by right, and that's for the multifamily residential component. Tucson, a city that has very comparable parking requirements to the city, and I think when we get into looking at our parking code and other parking codes nationally, they all draw from that same base of information that was derived kind of in the 1950s and the 1960s, and so that information existed and it kind of bled through a lot of municipal codes, and so Tucson probably has a model that's very similar to ours. But when we get into their reductions, projects with density of over 70 units per acre get a 20 to 25% reduction. In their downtown, the residential gets between 35 and 45%. There's some additional reductions for office and hotels, and then citywide, you're able to request up to a 30% reduction for any use. Coming back a little bit closer to home, when we look at Miami has a 50% reduction for most urban core uses and 100% for residential uses in the urban core. And the reduction factors that they look at are very similar to the ones that we look at. So do you have a supporting study that kind of examines the ins and the outs and how that interaction with uses within close proximity works? Do you offer shared parking? Are you close to specific transects? And so while you may not be providing the density and the intensity, are you in close proximity to the densities and intensities that support transit. And so that's something to consider. And then they also have some objectives to help with infill projects, so smaller projects up to 10,000 square feet. And then finally, we'll close with Tampa. And they allow allowable reductions inside the central business district for multifamily. It's up 30 to 35%. Office and hotels and retail isn't quite where we are. On the retail, we offer up to 100% reduction in the central business district. And the other thing that we want to point out here is that their multifamily residential rates citywide are within 2 to 4% of ours. So we thought this was a pretty good comparison. And just as we do, they offer other reductions through their zoning official or through special board approval. And so we highlighted 10 cities, but we actually took a look at 17 cities. And so when we looked at the case notes in some of these other cities, what are the justifications for reductions? And it's pretty much the same stuff. It's proximity to transit, provision of alternative transportation amenities. Do you offer shared parking? Proximity to transit. So very, very similar. We're not doing anything that's too out of the ordinary. So on question 4, is the 40% reduction that we allow reasonable and supportable? And so before we get into kind of the yeses and the nos, we wanted to take a look at one last case study, and this is 55 West Church Street. And so many of you know this is a joint use garage. There's reserved resident parking and there's general public parking. And so for residents that don't feel they have enough parking, they have the option to sort of purchase additional parking spaces in the public area. And so Jason and his crew went out and collected some counts on a Sunday and on a Tuesday, I believe, at night when the peak demand was the highest. And so when you look at the weekend count, you see that the demand per occupied unit is about 0.75 spaces per dwelling unit. And then when you look at the weeknight count, which most people are at home working during the week, so they're at home during the weeknights, it's 1.04 spaces per dwelling unit demand. And then when we take a look at our code, the multifamily residential requirement for this project was 1.65 spaces per unit. And so when we look at the weekend count, we parked this project at about 45, or the demand is about 45% of the required minimum, and on the weeknight, it's about 63% of the required minimum. So in one case, it's 55% less than the required minimum, and then in the other case, it's about 37% less than the required minimum. So the conclusion that we reach from that is that the peak residential parking is below a code minimum for this downtown development. So to kind of recap, what we're really looking at here is that parking demand varies with location. The oversupply of parking is really costly in terms of increases in per unit cost, the decreases in usable area, and the disincentive to the other modes, which we're investing in as a community and promoting as a community. Our parking reduction policies really mirror those nationally. The reduced requirements also help Orlando move towards other modes of transportation. And so the one thing I was just going to kind of close with on this slide was that when we did the downtown transportation plan in 2006, the executive summary in the front had a whole bunch of recommendations. And so one of the recommendations that we had was to invest in other modes of traffic, and really transportation. Really what they looked at is they looked at kind of the usable area to increase road capacity, and they said you might be able to make some incremental changes at intersections, but really there is no additional area to kind of widen or whatnot. And so in order for downtown to sort of grow to the next level, we had to start investing in other modes. And so when you look at the investment that we've made in BRT and the bike ped infrastructure, that's for a reason. And then the other thing that the study pointed out was that we as an organization needed to sort of balance our parking supply. And so one of the things that they told us we really should discourage is adding a whole lot of parking within the central business district. And so when we looked at the Orlando Central project, we kind of had that in the back of our mind, and they said that parking should be added sort of at the periphery of downtown. And so when we looked at the 520 East Central project, that was a project that we said, hey, this area needs parking. And so those are kind of two factors that weighed into our decision making on those two very different projects. So moving forward, what we'd like to do is amend Part 3 of Chapter 61 to create a tiered approach to parking reductions. We'd maintain the 40% cap, and what our goal would be to kind of quantify the process for all concerned. And so we have some suggested tiers based on some of the things that we've discussed this morning, and we'll probably be moving forward with this in upcoming months. And so with that, I'm available for any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you, FJ. Questions or comments? Let's start with Commissioner Sheehan, and then Commissioner Stewart, and then Commissioner Gray.
Thanks, FJ, and I do have some concerns. A lot of times where I'm finding we're having problems on new infill developments is where we're having reserve parking in these condos. I mean, we allow them to go ahead and do lots that are supposed to, and people are supposed to be sharing it with visitors and different things like that, and then they reserve the spaces, and then you've got an empty lot with reserved spaces, and then what's happening is the spillover is going out in the neighborhood. Delaney Park is an excellent example of that, where I'm really having a problem. And again, we're allowing them to say, okay, you don't have to have that much parking because you should be sharing the lots, but they're not sharing the lots. And then we're getting this huge, spillover into neighborhoods. I'm also having this problem on Michigan Street. Again, the idea is great, but the execution isn't so good. And we're even finding these in some of the buildings. I know a little bit in Uptown, too, we're having this issue where they're supposed to be sharing the spaces with the restaurants and everything, and then they sell a condo, and then they do it reserved. You drive in the garage, and it's all empty, except they're all reserved spots. You can't park in them. So again, while it might sound good on paper, it's not working in actual, execution. So, I just have some concerns with this idea. If we're going to allow this flexibility, you can't have the flexibility if they're going to have the ability to make the lots, the parking spaces private and reserved.
Yeah, and that's a great point. The one thing that kind of blows up any shared parking agreement is the reservation of spaces. Yep. And so that may be one of those things where if we've allowed a shared parking agreement, we need to maybe go back and examine how it's actually being administered or implemented.
Well, we're permitting it, and then and we're allowing it, and then usually what happens is the reservation of the parking spaces comes later.
Yes, yeah. Some guy with a bucket of paint can go out and
right.
kind of, yeah.
So, and again, I understand where people say, well, I bought this unit and I want to have a reserved space, but then when they have visitors or guests or whatever, instead of having a lot that can accommodate these guests and this ebb and flow of visitors, it's all spilling out into the residential neighborhoods. And I like the infill development. I think it works. It's working on Michigan. It's working on Delaney. They're good projects. But the problem is that, again, you're getting this huge spillover into the neighborhoods, and that's not making the residential area very happy.
Right.
And I've even had some developers who say they want to provide more parking if they feel that if they want to do this reserved parking, then they're going to need more spaces. There's no flexibility in the code for them to do that. So if they want to do this reserved parking stuff, and they want to say, okay, we know it's going to create a problem where we're going to have issues, we want to provide more parking because of our reserved parking, they can't do that under this code.
Okay, so maybe...
Which would be, and who's brought that up to me is Craig Usler with Uptown. Because he said, I understand that some of my units want to have these reserved spaces, but then again, I want to have the ability to provide a few extra to kind of make up for that, and I can't under the current code. So that's a concern that I have too.
Okay. Well, and that may be handled, maybe we look at like ask them to provide like an operational study that kind of takes those reserved spaces off the table, and so those you really can't count because they're reserved. and then the other spaces are kind of a net addition to that.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, we can't have it both ways. You can't say you're going to
Yeah.
have reserved parking and then count it towards shared parking. You can't do that. And if they want to provide reserved, then they should have flexibility in our code to provide extra spaces just so people can be able to park in their own development. And I think that's a situation where the developer should be able to come in and be able to ask for those things, especially if they're willing to build those spaces.
Just, FJ, have you seen anybody that's developed a formula to use when there are reserved spaces versus unrestricted?
I'd have to ask our folks in planning. I know we've looked at formulas for shared parking, but I'm not sure how that reserved component comes into it. And again, I think a lot of it, as the commissioner had said, is happening after the fact.
Yep.
And so we allowed the shared parking agreement, and then, like I said, somebody, just comes in and starts striping and reserving kind of after the fact. And in some cases, we know about that because it's come through as maybe a code enforcement action, and then in other cases, we really don't know about it, unless we talk to the commissioners.
Well, and we hear about the issues after the fact. That's the problem, and then there's no way to fix it after it's done. So anyway, a couple other things that I'd like to say. I agree that the bicycle parking is a lot better. We used to, and bike share is wonderful. I mean, that's really helped fill that niche. But, I've fussed about this and fussed about this. We do need motorcycle parking too, because some people can't ride that far. And scooter parking in other cities, they're very liberal about where our people are allowed to park scooters. And now a lot of my people in the high-rise condos got scooters because they'd be able to tool around town. When there's nowhere, they have absolutely nowhere they can park them. And I know we've added some, but where we've added them, it's not been very scooter-friendly, because scooter parking has to be where people can keep an eye on them, because people will steal them. So again, if we put it in the middle of, Bob Snow Boulevard, in the middle of that lot, or, we tend to put them in not very desirable areas, people aren't going to use them. So I think, and again, what I found about motorcycle parking that's great, in Thornton Park, we've got 2 spots right there on Washington Street that was not enough to accommodate a regular vehicle, so we put 2 scooter parking spaces in. What's great is scooter and motorcycle people share, so you can even park up to 15 motorcycles in 2 spaces, because they're going to share. And I think that's a great thing. So I think we need to find more ways to accommodate that. If there's not a place for a traditional, parking spot, if we can do these non-traditional parking spots and find ways for people to share them. Something else on some of the cities, I've been to Miami and I've been to Tampa. You can find a spot to pay for usually in Miami, but good luck in Tampa. I mean, they have allowed a lot of infill development with reserved parking in these condos, and you want to talk about a mess. Down, Howard, Armenia, that area, you cannot find parking. So, again, I think we need to be very careful about emulating other cities that have problems. I think we should be emulating cities that have more solutions. And while 55 West, I agree that you're saying it needs to vary, because 55 West is live, work, play, and some of these other areas too, but that's not going to apply to all these condos, so I think we need to be careful about a one-size-fits-all approach on that. So again, I think we really need to look at this reserved parking, we need to look at the shared parking. And another thing that I've been finding in the main streets that's kind of been frustrating is that when they have a new development come into a main street area, and it has a large lot, they say they have to take spaces out. Well, the problem I have with that, and I think it's silly, is because these main street areas already exist. They're thriving. And we're already kind of having a parking problem as it is. They're a victim of their own success. And then we get a new development and we tell them to take the few parking spaces we have out, which is crazy. What's happening is that it's already kind of happening organically. They're already sharing. They're already doing valet. They're already, let business do what business does best. And if a businessman has a lot and he knows that he can, work with a restaurant down the street and do valet parking, he's going to do that, or he or she. And if we just automatically tell that new development person who's coming into an area, well, you have to take out 15 spaces, they're like, what? I mean, it's expensive for them to take the spaces out to begin with, and we're also creating even more of a parking deficit in our main streets. So I think we need to be very careful about requiring these spaces to come out. I think we need to give flexibility because, again, these main street areas are taking care of themselves. They're, you know, we did it in Mills 50. We made the Mills 50 folks come in and say they would use the extra spots when they already were doing it. So it's kind of frustrating to me when we have that, you know, this idea that, you know, well, you're way over parked, so we have to take that out. I mean, I think it creates an onerous problem for business owners when they actually are solving their own problem, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think when you looked at the Miami example, and they had a special portion of their code that dealt with projects that were under 10,000 square feet, and so maybe examination of some of those smaller uses in infill areas would probably be a good idea.
I'm not sure, you know, and one of them is the vet on you know, Lock Haven Veterinary Clinic had moved, and he was having a terrible problem with having takeout spaces. So I want, whatever you guys are doing to him, I don't want you to do it to the businesses, because, again, they'll work it out amongst themselves.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Commissioner, I just wanted to add that if you recall, earlier this year, we amended the code with regard to substantial rehabilitation of buildings in our Main Street areas that addresses that very issue. So you're not required to remove spaces to put in extra landscaping or water retention or other things on that site. Before, it was considered a substantial rehabilitation. You would have had to do all those things, but now you don't have to do that.
Good.
So we're not going to lose the spaces.
But I still think I would be remiss to not bring that up, you know, with these discussions, because these are all problems that, again, we as commissioners get to deal with. Yay. After the fact, we get to have the fun because, you know, again, this is the nuts and bolts of doing what we do. And, you know, and another thing is, I think we need to be really sensitive to no parking and different things like that, and make sure we've got 2-hour parking to move people along, that the streets aren't being used for long-term warehousing of cars. That we have to reach a balance. Even so, with these, you know, because what usually happens is people get upset when there's an overdevelopment and people are parking in the neighborhood, and then they want no parking in the neighborhood. Well, I think if we have maybe 2-hour parking to move uses along, that way we can encourage, you know, the businesses to maybe be able to take advantage of some of this neighborhood parking, but not for long term and not for just storing cars.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I think the mayor started in his opening comments, mentioned balance. You just mentioned balance, and then, you know, go back to the downtown transportation plan. Balancing that parking system with everything else that's going on is important.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good thoughts. Commissioner Stewart.
Let me also cover a couple of things. I don't think anybody on this board doesn't agree that we ought to do something in terms of discount, in terms of spacing. I think the challenge always becomes the devil in the details. I like the idea at the back where you kind of put some numbers to it. But it seems that often it's more subjective based upon the combination of dealing with the planning staff and dealing with what the capacity of the developer has and what he needs to make money on. A couple of points, and I reiterate what Commissioner Sheehan said, so I won't spend a lot of time covering those, but some issues that I have some concern about. And let's look at 55 West as a good example. The first question I would ask is, what's the current occupancy of 55 West? Before you start with the idea of the spacing is different. Is the occupancy at 60%? If it's at 60%, then it really doesn't much matter what you're doing in terms of the building. So if the occupancy is at 60%, but the parking lot is also at 60%, then we're kind of on task. And that's why I didn't see in here is what's the building occupancy in terms of the mixed use as well as the residential.
Yeah, I had the same question, and so when I looked through there, that was the demand per occupied unit, and so we looked at the units that were occupied and said, well, what is the demand per unit? And so that's how we derived the figures here. And so I think if we had looked at it based on, I think the numbers would still be the same. So if you're at 95% occupancy or 90% occupancy, your demand per occupied unit would be similar. So yeah, I had the same question though.
I guess I didn't see here what your occupancy is for the building. Because what I saw is a
We can get
maximum
that.
space of 1,092 spaces.
Yep.
But you're telling us that the weekend counts for public and private are significantly less. Well, I think the building's probably also significantly less in terms of occupancy.
Yeah, we can get that for
So,
you.
and that's, but I think you may find that if it's at 50% occupancy and you're using 60% of the spaces,
Yeah.
that's the balance. If it's the reverse, then we're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Commissioner Stewart, good point. Just to let you know, I work with the management at 55 West to figure out what the occupancy as well as how many bedroom units they have occupied. They're at 92% occupancy of all their leasable units today, and that includes the expansion on the top 4 floors.
So
of that
92%
particular-
occupancy of, you're considering that as,
Of each of their building, or of their units that are being leased currently and occupied, they have 92% occupancy of all their units today when we took these figures, basically. So,
okay, now that was the condo that converted to rental, I think, is that correct?
correct, they're all being rented, but there's also a difference between leased and occupied because there's some people that hadn't quite moved in yet.
Right.
But they're currently, when we took these figures, they were 92% occupied with people actually living there. And of course, we found out there were less demand for parking on the weekends, and that was probably because there are folks that go out of town, obviously, so it was about 25% less.
Yeah.
But during the week, that parking demand that you saw per unit was about at 1.04 per
Okay.
unit. So that's probably the peak parking demand per unit adjusted for that particular building.
Am I correct to say that with what we required of them was 1,092 spaces? Am I reading that correctly?
No, basically, that building has a nested area that's gated for the resident parking, and it also happens to be reserved, like Commissioner Sheen was
Right,
talking about.
right.
And as you can see, the actual occupancy of that particular garage is about half of what the required amount of space is, and then we have an additional 400 and some public spaces. And because of the inefficiencies of those reserved spaces, you got 61 additional folks that are living there. They're leasing that parking from the public side. So you can see that as a result of having reserved spaces, you almost have a 50% increase in the required amount of parking spaces practically, and that's the conclusion that I think she's kind of making. And as we've looked at our parking code, we've gone through and noticed the locations where we're starting to provide reductions in parking. We're making sure that those reserved parking spaces can't be done. And you can experience that in our own very garage when you're passing a lot of spaces that are empty that are reserved. So we want to make sure when we're doing parking efficiency like that, we don't have reserved parking.
Correct me, it seems to me, if I remember correctly, there was something in the 55 West in parking where the city was leasing some of those spaces.
Well, the city also leases spaces for the fire department.
Right, right.
And that's also nested as well and gated off in the public area of the garage.
So in your count, does your count include that as part of the public spaces, or is it part of the reserved spaces, or was it just?
That's part of the
Selected.
public spaces because it's on the public side of the garage.
I
and if
agree, but
you-
I mean, did your count included, when you went back and counted, your
Yes,
count included them as public?
as part of the
part of the
public
public,
spaces of the
okay.
garage, because that's not part of the resident parking that's over there.
So how many apartments are there?
There's approximately 475. I don't have the exact figure off the top of
So
my
at
head.
92%,
So they're at 92%. I remember that they had 420 spaces, or 420 units that are actually occupied at this point in time.
Okay.
That you could probably see.
it's got 420 units, and you're telling me that according to what you've got here in terms of reserved, that on a weeknight count, they would have less than one parking space.
They would have
Per-
1.04, so just a little bit over one parking space per unit that would be occupied. So if we go back to that slide, actually,
Yeah,
you'll see in the resident reserved area, that's 612 parking spaces, and in
Right.
the public area, you got 480
Hey, right.
additional parking spaces. The requirement for the building was around 612, and you can tell here, weekend count, they were at 253 folks parked in that parking area, plus they had 61 resident passes that were sold for the general area of the public area. If we consider that each one of those folks were parked, the total amount of resident parkers in that garage in total was 314, which is about 3/4 of a space per unit. And then on the weeknight, you got 376 folks that are parked in that reserved area, and then there were 91 folks in the public area, which probably counted some of the fire department folks. 61 folks that potentially would be in the public area, and just to be generous, we considered all those people being parked, which would have been 437 parkers there. So that would have been about 1.04 per unit. So, in other words, the requirement for the amount of bedrooms that they have in that particular building is 1.65. So if you go through the whole...
Right, right.
So they're a little bit, about
Underneath that.
two-thirds of the required parking is actual demand that you're seeing at that particular building.
Okay, so let me ask a different way.
Yeah.
When you walked in the building, there were more than 600 unused spaces in the building?
Yes. When you're looking at the peak hour in the middle of the night.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yes.
More than 600 on the weeknight and 700 or so on the
Yes.
weekend.
Yes, that 480 public parking space area during the day, that's taken up by office workers
Right.
and folks, because that's one of the
Right,
reasons why
right.
we did that. But if you're looking at the peak hour and trying to control for what the actual demand is for residential units, these are the figures that we're looking at and are coming out of that study.
Okay, good, good. Thank you. Okay, that's the key question, was the 92%. So that's how you got to that. I just wasn't quite as clear.
And Commissioner, on 55 West, that was a little bit different because that was an existing city parking garage, and we required them to build those public spaces to replace the ones that were demolished.
Yeah, that's, I remember there was something that was caught in there. Now, let me ask, here you've got what is a relatively mature or probably the more demand of a typical apartment complex is that we're in the downtown corridor. A better mixed use is probably the plaza. Have we done any study on the plaza to look at that? Because that now you have really, I think, a little bit more of a consistent mixed use, traditional mixed use, if I would call it, and that inside its own building is both residential, mixed use, operation for movie theater, all that's kind of built into the one spot. Do we have any idea of the capacity of that and what's available? Or we just, did you do anything on that, Jason?
Well, since we don't have control of that parking garage, we weren't able to do the specific
Okay, good
study
point,
and turn it
yeah.
around like we potentially could have. So
point.
what we were trying to do is just trying to figure out what the requirement it is per residential unit in the downtown, and that was the best available option for us to get some figures and turn it around to you. Since we don't control the plaza parking garage, it was a little more difficult.
Plus, that parking garage should never be replicated in the city of
You're
Orlando
absolutely right
ever
about that.
again.
And that's the point I want to make also, is that part of
Yeah.
the challenge that we have is that people don't park there because they hate it. They hate getting in, hate getting out. It's incredibly tight. We ended up putting some, requiring some spaces to go there. And I think you find that because of where it is and how it's designed, people don't now use it. So you may have this counter theory that may be 150 or 200 spaces unused because people are just would rather park one block over and not run the risk of having their car being damaged.
You're absolutely correct. It's not a transit incentive to design a parking garage that way. But just so you know, the last time that we modified the parking ordinance, I'm going to say about 4 years ago, it was to address the dimension requirements
Right.
of parking spaces, just to
Right.
deal with that. The 55 West garage, and I park there frequently. My wife actually parks there every day. She's a normal parker there for her office building. It's a lot more generously in terms of the dimensions for those parking spaces. So there probably wouldn't be as much of a disincentive to park there as you would find at some of the other garages in downtown.
The other impact they have is some of the public spaces in these private locations is we've had issues about what people charge. So that has an impact on whether they're available or not. That's another challenge that we would often try to address. We can't control what they charge for parking. We have to say they have to have general parking available. But what happens when we see those numbers? It seems to me, and I'm gosh, I'm not encouraging this, but we ought to take what you're doing and kind of expand it a little bit more in terms of a parking study to balance this. I can't speak for Commissioner Gray, but I can tell you that in my mind, having bona fide numbers to be able to justify what's going on is important to us. When you have a 40% reduction, I'd like to be able to say that we have two other locations that have been actually experiencing a 60% reduction, and how do you, and we think this 40% is acceptable.
We did, either Transportation or Public Works had a study done several years ago. We may just go back and see what was done and then just kind of update that study.
That was
I think they were
designed
looking at
around
more at supply.
what parking was available, what's within a quarter of a mile of the venues and all the rest of that, which I think was
Yeah.
great stuff. And maybe we could just modify and see what is available. But if we're giving incentives to people in their buildings, even if it's a private building like the plaza, we ought to be able to walk in and say, hey, let's just check and see if our capacity and code is correct. But I understand the other is a little bit freer, easier to get to. Other question, concerns, I guess I'm looking at is when you look at Miami, I think Commissioner Sheehan is correct. But a definition, I'm trying to understand, 100% reduction for residential uses in the urban core. Are you telling me that, I guess probably, I would ask for the general public, if I'm putting 50 or 100 apartments in the urban core in Miami, I haven't got to require any parking at all?
Yeah, and that's their policy now. Is you as a developer may want to provide some sort of drop off, loading, that kind of stuff, and so. But the way the code is written, there is no required parking.
Okay, so I do a mixed-use project and I have 500 apartments. I don't have to put, in the urban core of Miami,
Right.
I have to provide anything, I'm not required to provide anything for residential. Although, as a developer, I would want to do something.
Yeah, and they probably have loading requirements.
Loading or minimum or
temporary,
Or reserve
pick up and
spots,
drop.
as we talked about before.
Right.
I've got a couple other notes and I'll get out of your way. The joint parking agreement comes to mind in terms of a question, how public is that information? Because part of the challenge I have with what we're doing in terms of parking is when you're doing public parking, are we requiring proper notice of people to have public parking? I'll pick on the Wellesley in downtown College Park. Every time we talk about parking in College Park, we find that there's, I think, 75 to 100 spaces in the Wellesley that are designed for public use and open for public use, and I think up to 2 hours, I think, is free parking there. But you tell somebody about it, they have no idea that's there, not available. As far as they're concerned, it just doesn't exist. So when you begin to have this public parking, are we requiring them to have proper notice, at least if it's available for public use?
Yeah, and again, that I think gets into Commissioner Sheehan's point about sort of the mechanics of how it's done, and I'm not sure there is a noticing requirement.
Yeah.
We can, we look at those shared use agreements or those joint parking agreements, and so that's something that we can contemplate adding when we do see them. I mean, so a project would come in, it has a required amount of parking, and they said, well, we're going to get parking from a third party. We have to review those agreements just to make sure that it's doing what it needs to do, and so we probably look at noticing and some of the other reserve policies as well, maybe add those as additional line items to the agreement.
Well, in the Wellesley, they were open, and then we asked leadership over there to put some additional signage, and that seemed to help out a little bit. And then now we've got some other projects that are coming on that we're offering pretty good parking. I mean, part of the challenge that we have in some of these outlying areas is that the city doesn't have the ability to provide the parking. We're requiring the developer to provide the parking. Don't have much of a problem with some of that, but if we're going to require that they have parking, then we've got to make sure that the community knows that it's there. Because the assumption is, I'm not going to pull into a building unless I clearly know it's there. I do like the idea of the evidence. I would love to see some other spot check different types of locations. I have a concern when we're looking at the projects that are at the corner of Roslyn and Central. You have two projects that are there. My concern is you're getting ready to have probably 1,000 parking spaces between those two projects, and they're going to dump out on the two streets that I don't know that they're adequately addressed I think the parking for the building's okay, but now all of a sudden you're going to put another 1,000 vehicles at that intersection. How are you going to get them in? How are you going to get them out? That's a challenging intersection on any given day, especially during the workday. because of the left turn, right turn, all the rest of that stuff. So that becomes an important part of the devil in the details again. You've got 500 or 600 spaces. How are you going to get these guys in and out of them? We did a good job at the Princeton, where we kind of put it in and out on one side, and that was kind of a neat way to do it, but it was the unique environment that we had there that could make it work out. And I got one last question. On the Orlando Central project, it comes to mind that you have two issues that are addressed, and I kind of touched on them. One is when a developer comes to us, they come to us, and I believe that they should clearly know what the rules are. That's one of the issues that we have, and I like your formula at the back. But on Orlando Central project, why 478? Was it a function of capacity by zone, by coding? Was it a function of what they could afford? All that seems to be very subjective to me.
I would imagine it probably had something to do with how much could they get in without having to add an additional floor plate.
So it's a function of how much money they can make on what's there and what they can put in. And we are comfortable that we feel that based upon the history of the 55 West, that they're probably not going to exceed the reductions that they were encouraged. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were comfortable with that, and for all the other items that we listed in the slide, proximity downtown core, Sunrail, limo, it has great walkability. Gertrude's Walk is right at the front door, and then you've got two public facilities in very close proximity.
Again, I think all of us think those are good ideas. I do like the idea of defining that. So the question is, if it's bikeability, should it be 2% or 5% or 10%? I mean, that's a discussion that we ought to have, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and then that's the bulk of the work in the near future as it pertains to this
and
topic.
Commissioner Sheehan's exactly right. I mean, the idea of what's happening with scooters, motor scooters especially, getting around town. A guy can pop on a scooter from downtown, go over to Publix, pull in, get their food, come back, do it once or twice a week. Then should we be providing that kind of incentive?
Yeah.
And what's the value of that? That's always been the issue. All right, I'm sorry I took too long, but thank you very much. I appreciate the information.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Gray?
Thank you, Mayor. FJ, thanks to you and your team for doing this. Certainly, I don't have the right answers, but I appreciate, Mayor, you bringing this up for discussion. So I guess when this first came up on Orlando Sentinel, I didn't have any empirical evidence. It just seems to me when we look, not where we are today, but where we'll be in 20 years, any stabilized, mature city I've been to has a parking challenge, meaning lack of parking spaces. And so as I look at it, it's not where we are today, but kind of where we're going. And that kind of falls into two categories, availability and cost. To me, the challenge, and you guys know I'm in the office building world, you never have enough parking. Buildings that were built in downtown Orlando in the 80s and the 90s have about 2 per 1,000 parking, maybe 3. And the trend in the office world is we're putting more people in less space. And so there's a bigger demand for parking spaces we can't accommodate as landlords and building owners. And so a lot of our tenants are going to municipal parking garages and parking lots, and they're finding other alternatives. And so I guess my issue is, while this might work for the residential people, I think as leaders we've got to think about, as downtown matures, how do we accommodate certainly office building owners as they grow, because that's our employment base, but it's also the retailers and other users. And so I guess the concern I had, and what brought this up, was if in fact people, residential units need more than one per unit and they don't do them, they're going to go and take up the available space that's out there, whether it's parking garages, excuse me, on the street, whatever. So that was a part for me on the availability, to make sure that we don't shortchange ourselves. Commissioner Sheehan brought up about the reserved. I don't think you ever get away from that, whether it's commercial or residential. For whatever reason, people want their own parking spot, and it's something we struggle with all the time. People want that, but you're right. Tenants will complain to us. They go 2 floors as they're winding up, and half of the spaces are empty, and sooner or later, they just divert and they park anyway. And then you have an issue. So I don't know how we get around that. But from a cost perspective, FJ, did you say when we kind of today evaluate these, does some of that relate to the proximity to public parking? Is that fair? Or did I misinterpret that?
You said cost?
Well, or availability. In other words, if one project's closer to public parking today than another, do they get some special benefits by being close to public parking?
Well, we have the whole pedestrian shed, and so if
Okay.
there's a public facility that is receiving the parking demand, we could actually count that. If it's outside of the pedestrian shed, and there's, based on districts, there's different walking distances. So you would get the benefit if you were in close proximity. If both uses were in the same pedestrian shed area, they would both get the benefit.
Got it. Because that, to me, is the cost part. I mean, parking spaces cost somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000 per space. That's kind of the market. I don't think it matters whether you're office or residential. Structured parking is at least $15,000 a space on average. Some would push it to 20. And so if you look at Orlando Central, and again, nothing against those folks, they asked for it and we gave it to them. By reducing the parking space by 257 spaces, the cost of that project went down $3.8 million. And again, good for them. But the challenge and the reason I was asking that is, if you look at just 520, your example, they only got a 25% reduction, right? So if you do the math.
Yeah, I'm not sure, we didn't grant that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, if we do, that would be a $2.2 million. My point is, you've got about $4,500 difference just in cost between two projects. And I think as a group, we got to be careful that we don't, through parking variances, give folks a competitive advantage over each other. I think we need to be consistent so everybody can compete on the same level as it relates to parking costs, because it's expensive to build structured parking. And especially if those folks are going into their overflow is into public spaces, because we've helped pay for it. Right, so that's all I'm cautioning as we look at that. Certainly by being close to transit, it helps. But at the very end of the day, for me, the challenge still is, I think, no matter how close folks are to mass transit, whether it's rail, bus, most people today still own a car, because we're just not to mature enough on all of that yet. We'll get there. And I've got 7 millennials in my office, and I ask them, and they live downtown, and they walk to work. Sometimes they ride together, but they all own cars. And while they may not be on the streets, which is good for us, they're still in a parking garage at the complex they live in downtown. So, again, in summary, my thoughts are, if we have any reservation about spillover into public garages or streets, I think we err on the side of asking property owners to accommodate, as opposed to take the risk that they don't have enough, because I think it could have a negative impact as we continue to mature downtown. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hill?
Thank you, sir. I'm brief. I echo Commissioner Sheehan's sentiment regarding the private public parking, and somewhat trying to amend that ordinance versus later than right now. I know, moving forward, I apologize, moving forward, when we're having projects that come aboard. I agree with staff, as I stated during the briefing, while we're looking, putting policies in place for the next 5, 10, 15 years from now. We can't undo what has been done, but moving forward, that, as Commissioner Gray and Stewart stated, that we're considerate regarding the developer, but most definitely the residents and some of the business owners, not some, but all business owners down here, because I think the vision is to make downtown walk, live, play. And that's why we're investing in mass transit we don't want those multi-billion-dollar investments to go under because we don't have people utilizing them. Also, I would like for us to consider more moped parking and motorcycles, and of course, bike shares, as I have had the privilege now to travel more extensively. That's what I see in all the progressive cities throughout the nation, is motorcycles, mopeds, and bikes, less cars. And I know this is a little off topic. I'm moving from downtown to the west side because parking is a problem there also. And since we were talking about parking and residents having parking, is around the Citrus Bowl. I'm getting a lot of concerns about no parking. Most of the residents there that rent or own homes there around the Citrus Bowl driveways, they don't have 2-car or 3-car garages, and most of their driveways are 50 feet, if that. And I took a ride over there last week, and on every street around that Citrus Bowl says no parking on the right and left-hand side. So we're concerned, which I am concerned about visitors and people parking here in our high-rises downtown. I would like for family members to be able to visit their families on the west side and not be concerned about not having a place to park or being ticketed. So I think we need to address that immediately about the no parking there around the Citrus Bowl on the right and left-hand side, and their yards can't accommodate visitors of family members to park in, usually only 1 car. So that's...
And that may have something to do with overall event management, and so...
Well, we need to still fix that because they should have a right to have family members come visit them and park.
I understand.
I just had one more wrap-up thing, too. You know, I'd like to think that we can count garages as parking spaces, but people fill their garages with junk. They can't park their cars in them, and especially with the condos, it's been a problem. You know, they're not parking spaces. They are, you know, receptacles for more stuff. We are a consumer culture, and people fill every inch they can with stuff. And again, you know, I think they work better if they're open, or if they're a pull-in bay or something like that, as opposed to a garage, because people will just load that up with junk.
Yeah, and I think the Michigan project that you alluded to is the one that has really magnified that issue.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner FJ. I think you got a lot of good input.
Yes, we have a lot of input.
Okay, we'll take that, digest it, and we'll come back
Will do.
in a couple months.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our workshop for the day.